So you have someone who's born heterosexual, bisexual, or homosexual. So why is there this thing where God would say, that's fine, but that's not fine. And he creates them knowingly like that. And then in the past, the church has said these people are mentally ill, they deserve to be, put in institutions, penalized, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I could go on and on about that. But my question is, why do you say that if I'm going to be a Christian again, then I need to repent from being LGBTQI+, and then accept this narrow version of the gospel? That to me is like conversion therapy, and the UN and all these other major medical organizations in the US and around the world have called that torture. So for you to stand here and to defend that, that's pretty messed up. What is your response to that?
This is a pertinent and powerful question for those who wish to understand Christianity in light of LGBT issues. Why would God demand for anyone to deny or totally suppress their sexual orientation when decades of research from reputable medical organizations shows that is not evidently possible, and that organized efforts to achieve that end are extremely harmful to LGBT people? This clip comes from the channel of Frank Turek, the hyper-conservative evangelical Christian apologist who I've responded to more than anyone else. If you've seen any of his content or even any of my responses to him, you can probably guess how he responds to yet another charge that his rhetoric is harmful.
Well, Mav, let me ask you a question. What is your standard of morality?
I'm myself, I'm a secular humanist. I think that everybody is innately good.
What do you mean by good?
Well, obviously murder is wrong.
Why?
Because if I went and murdered someone's kid, then that mother or father would not have a child, and they would be in mourning, and that caused them some great psychological turmoil for the rest of their lives and trauma they're going to have to work through in therapy. So objectively, we can see psychologically, they're not going to be doing too hot. So of course, but that's objectively wrong.
Why is it objectively wrong to harm people?
Yeah, this is what Frank Turek always says when someone claims he's hurting people. It sets him up to play what he and his fans consider his trump card.
You're importing a moral standard into your atheistic system, and you're stealing it from a theistic worldview. There is no objective moral standard unless some kind of God exists. Everything is just a matter of human opinion.
Turek reasons, no moral standard exists without the God of the Bible, so you can't make any moral claim about me unless it's founded on my God. This is a pretty brilliant move, rhetorically, as it appears to defeat any non-Christian's claim that Turek has behaved unethically. Of course, I could point out that even if his God's objective moral standard exists, all humans still have to interpret that standard and how to apply it through their own subjective perception. This renders all moral deliberation among humans as nothing but what he calls one opinion against another. I'm not here to argue Turek's point on this, though, because if we continue watching this clip, we see Turek state a moral position of his that makes this conversation a whole lot more interesting.
And so when you hold up a sign that says that certain people have treated LGBTQ people wrongly,
have, and there's so much evidence for it.
Mav, you might be exactly right about that. But
I am. I have experiences and data to back it up.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry that people have treated you poorly. But
you don't have to go on and spread these bigoted viewpoints on YouTube and Facebook like you do. It's just a bunch of misinformation. You have no idea. You have blood on your hands.
Okay, Mav. Do you want to have a conversation, or you just want
No, I really just would like you to just apologize and turn around and see that what you're doing is harmful.
Mav, there's only harm if God exists. Harm is only evil if God exists. And so you're stealing...
harm regardless if God exists or not.
Thank you, Mav. You're not interested. Thank you for coming. I think that, yes, people who identify as LGBTQ have been treated poorly. But I also think now that Christians are being treated poorly. And both of them are wrong. We ought to respect people even if we disagree with them.
Turek says that in his moral system, harm is evil and treating LGBT people poorly is wrong. Turek and Mav actually agreed on that premise the whole time. In order to discuss whether Turek's statements on LGBT issues are morally acceptable, it wasn't necessary for Mav to explain how atheists ground their moral claims. Turek could have explored whether his statements on LGBT issues are harmful within his own moral paradigm. So why did Turek choose not to do this? Well, investigating whether or not one truly does have blood on their hands in an impromptu conversation with a stranger in front of a crowd is tough and possibly time-consuming. And when you can use a powerful piece of rhetoric to get out of that conversation entirely, then let's just say that even men of God sometimes give in to temptation. If we were to investigate Turek's statements about LGBT people while applying his moral premise that harming them is wrong, would we find that Turek was behaving immorally? He's spoken about LGBT people a lot in his work, and like Mav said, there's a wealth of research on the subject. A review of that research could reveal whether or not Frank Turek has done wrong in his own moral paradigm and, however inadvertently, gotten blood on his hands. So, let's dive in. First, I want to say that this video has taken me well over a month of work, and because of the topic, is likely to lose me subscribers, receive extremely low ad rates, or even get completely demonetized. What still made this video possible is the loyalty of this channel's favorite sponsor, Ground News, the excellent news aggregator app and website that I actually use every day to stay informed. It was on Ground News where I first learned that the evangelical Christian Liberty University was just fined $14 million for failing to disclose crime data for their campus. To get the full story here, you can go to ground.news/skeptic and check it out. The link is in the description. AOL first broke this story a few days ago, and at the time I'm looking at this, more than 80 articles have been published on it. Let's take a closer look at this story. Comparing coverage is interesting. This headline emphasizes that the U.S. Department of Education fined Liberty University, giving the impression that the federal government has singled out the Christian university. In contrast, this one references the Federal Clery Act, a law that applies to all U.S. universities. See how a single word or phrase can significantly influence public perception? Tools like these make it easy to stay aware of inconsistencies in coverage, and I think that we can all agree the more access readers have to tools like these, the better. So, go to ground.news/skeptic to try it out. Subscribe through my link for 30% off unlimited access to the Vantage subscription, which is what I use. Or you can try it out for less than $1 this month. Seriously, thank you so much, Ground News. Now, back to examining Frank Turek's claims. Let's start here, where Turek explains how Christians should love LGBT people. Content warning, this contains discussion of sexual violence.
How do you engage with someone whose identity is deeply rooted in their sexuality? He has a friend who's gay who has a boyfriend, and they're both very well aware of each other's beliefs, but he doesn't know what to do further with that.
Let me point out that, in fact, I'm just talking to the lady I mentioned earlier at our house today. She was visiting my wife. She's on our board, the lady that works at Starbucks. She said every one of the 4 young transitioners have had brutal upbringings. One girl was raped by her grandfather. Another young man trying to transition to become a woman was pretty much rejected by his father and was made fun of by Christians.
This is definitely the gentlest tone I've ever heard Turek take, and it's probably the right one given the subject matter. He's saying all this to urge Christians to be compassionate toward LGBT people, right? Yeah, kind of. But also, he's got another point to make.
You may think it's stupid. You may think it's wrong. But you shouldn't mock people. You shouldn't belittle them. They're struggling. In fact, a friend of mine who's a mega pastor, you would know his name if I told it to you. This is what he said, just his experience. He said, I've never met a lesbian who wasn't sexually abused. And he's counseled a lot of them. So people don't just randomly say, at least older people don't randomly say, I just decided to be gay. There's something that happened in their lives normally.
Yeah, he told a room full of students that abuse and trauma is the cause of LGBT orientations and identities. What's his evidence for this?
The lady that works at Starbucks, She said every one of the 4 young transitioners have had brutal upbringings. In fact, a friend of mine who's a mega pastor, you would know his name if I told it to you. This is what he said, just his experience. He said, I've never met a lesbian who wasn't sexually abused.
A couple of his friends told him so. No studies or any academic sources cited. He's basing this on second-hand anecdotal evidence alone. The problem with anecdotes is that the process of collecting data to inform the conclusion is extremely subject to selection and confirmation biases. There's also no precise measurement or analysis of the factors in play in the phenomenon observed. This kind of evidence is not credible in the least. I should also point out that one of the anecdotes he cited doesn't support his conclusion in the first place.
Another young man trying to transition to become a woman was pretty much rejected by his father and was made fun of by Christians.
This trans woman was rejected and mocked by Christians because she was trans. Even in Turek's story, her gender nonconformity preceded her abuse. This brings me to what scientific literature says on the subject. This study, published in 2015, looked at the relationship between sexual orientation, childhood gender nonconformity, and childhood sexual abuse in a sample of over 1,700 participants. Its literature review covers the well-established fact that non-heterosexual people face more childhood sexual abuse than heterosexual people. It also discusses a 2013 article which suggested that the causal relationship between abuse and sexual orientation may go both ways. Other researchers in this field doubt that study's validity, though, so more research on this was needed. This study found that the relationship between these factors goes like this. Non-heterosexuality comes first, and childhood sexual abuse follows. Non-heterosexuality is also often concurrent with childhood gender nonconformity, which childhood sexual abuse also follows. Basically, it's not abuse that makes you queer, it's being nonconforming in orientation and/or gender that increases a child's risk of being abused. So, Frank Turek is wrong. He got the causal relationship here exactly backward. If we're to discuss Turek's moral wrongs, though, we should do so in light of what he says next.
And so you have to try and prayerfully see if you can help them address that and approve of them as a person, because they're made in the image of God and valuable just like anybody else. Christ died for everyone. So just because you may disagree on their behavior and what they're doing doesn't mean you can't love them. In fact, to love them, you have to disagree with what they're doing. So I think you need to take a soft approach and try and befriend them. My friend befriends these young girls all the time, and even there's a guy doing this, and now one of them's doing a Bible study with her.
So his advice for showing love to an LGBT person is disagreeing with their behavior, meaning sexual orientation or gender expression, and befriending them in order to help them not do that anymore. The issue here is sexual orientation and gender identity are not behaviors that can be purposely changed. Effectively, there is no accepting someone as a person while rejecting these characteristics, because these characteristics are a permanent part of someone's person. Interventions designed to change or suppress sexual orientation or gender identity, including religious interventions, are known to be harmful. Further, refusal of peers and especially parents to affirm and support a queer person is a primary factor for predicting suicidality in a queer person. Of course, I have scholarly sources to back all of this up. I didn't just hear this from my friend who works at Starbucks. The American Medical Association has a handy issue brief for the general public on the subject of sexual orientation change efforts. They say, so-called conversion therapy or reparative therapy refers to any form of intervention, such as individual or group, behavioral, cognitive, or milieu/environmental operations that attempts to change an individual's sexual orientation or sexual behaviors. Underlying these techniques is the assumption that any non-heterosexual, non-cisgender identities are mental disorders, and that sexual orientation and gender identity can and should be changed. This assumption is not based on medical and scientific evidence. Professional consensus rejects pathologizing sexual and gender identities. In addition, empirical evidence has demonstrated a diversity of sexual and gender identities that are normal variations of human identity and expression, and not inherently linked to mental illness. However, the unfounded misconception of sexual orientation and gender identity conversion persists among some health, spiritual, and religious practitioners. Now, I know that some viewers will respond, as others have before, that encouraging someone to adopt Christianity and simply resist their sinful, gender-related, and same-sex desires is not conversion therapy. To that I say, let's take another look at what that issue brief says. To the American Medical Association, sexual orientation change efforts include all efforts to change these characteristics in a person, even when they are practiced individually and focus on behavior cessation rather than a complete orientation change. Even this is not supported by scientific evidence and is considered harmful. It's also very clear that Frank Turek considers queer identities and expressions to be pathological, since they are usually caused by trauma in his mind. So the scientific consensus on this issue directly contradicts Turek's claims. The World Health Organization and the American Academy of Pediatrics, among countless other medical institutions, uphold this scientific consensus. Now to back up my statement about Turek's recommended approach being a contributing factor to suicidality in queer people. This study reports on a survey of trans people over the age of 16 in Ontario, Canada. As this table shows, those surveyed who reported the fewest suicide attempts were also those who reported the most parental and peer support for their gender identity. The authors state, while consideration of suicide did not differ significantly by level of social support, those with high levels of social support were significantly less likely to attempt suicide than those with little support, 2% versus 16%. Strong parental support for one's gender identity or expression was associated with significantly lower past-year prevalences of both suicidal consideration and attempts. Further, in this systematic review, which is a review of a large body of research, the authors state that marginalization, isolation, rejection, and being victims of phobic behavior are linked to poor mental health outcomes such as depression, self-harm, and suicidality. Young people who identify as a sexual or gender minority are a high-risk group who are developmentally vulnerable, and the family environment has been identified as an important protective factor against stressors and mental health problems in LGBTQIA+ youth. For example, in Growing Up LGBT in America, a national survey of LGBTQIA+ youth in the USA, the most important factor identified as a problem in their lives was non-acceptance by families, 26%. A lack of family connectedness or acceptance compounds the issues that sexual and gender minority youth have at school, further hindering their learning. And suicidality in youth has been shown to be related to family connectedness, identified as the most protective factor against suicidal ideation and attempt. I think it's reasonable, then, to say that supporting queer identities is demonstrably better for the mental health and physical well-being of queer people than refusing to affirm them and making friends with them just to help them stop being queer. Remember how Frank Turek said that harming LGBT people is evil and wrong? Well, I think it's clear in light of the evidence and in accordance with Turek's own moral premise that doing what Turek says one should do in order to love LGBT people is evil and wrong. Frank Turek is directly encouraging his audience to harm LGBT people. That's it. That's the video. Actually, no, I'm not done. As you can see by the runtime of this video, there's a lot more to cover. See, as our friend Mav said, Frank Turek tours the US, writes books, and does media appearances spreading harmful misinformation about LGBT issues. His career is now just as much about this as it is spreading the love of Jesus. So, if you enjoyed or learned something from the first part of this video, you're in luck. There's a lot more. His claims actually get a lot worse. Moving on to a video on Christian apologist Sean McDowell's channel, where he interviews Dr. Frank Turek, PhD in ministry, about a topic he's ever so qualified to talk about: trans issues. These two make so many claims in this video, I can't respond to all of them here, so I'll focus on a few which represent common myths about trans psychology and healthcare. And to preempt the comments that will inevitably say, well, you're not qualified to talk about this, I actually do have a psychology degree, and I've studied human sexuality specifically at the master's level. I'm relatively familiar with this topic. I also will actually provide scholarly sources for all of my claims, unlike Turek. The first clip I'll show is long, so bear with me.
Why do you think there's been a rise in transgender identification? And as you answer this, one of the responses people will give, and I've heard and tried to think about, is, well, maybe there's a rise in identification because finally there's cultural space for people to come out and identify as who they truly are.
Yeah, it is a complicated matter, but according to Abigail Shrier, who wrote the seminal book, Irresistible Damage, How the Transgender Craze is Seducing Our Daughters, she points out that, a decade or so ago, gender dysphoria was a condition that affected about 1 out of every 10,000 men. So men who thought that they were really women. But in the past decade or so, there's been almost a 5,000% increase of actually young girls claiming that they are boys. And according to her, and it seems to make sense, this is a social media contagion, Sean. This has passed almost entirely through the growth of social media. And she points out as well that there are other factors involved. In addition to social media, what do young people want more than anything? They just want to fit in, right? When you're a young person, you're a young teenager, you want to fit in. You want to be on the in group. What's the fastest way to fit in?
I'm still young, Frank, just for the record, but keep going.
What's the fastest and easiest way to fit in today's social media culture is to claim you're trans, because everybody will applaud. Anybody who says this is dangerous, don't go down this road, is going to be canceled or declared some kind of bigot. And it's also another way, because, we were teenagers, Sean. You always wanted to stick it to your parents every now and then, right? It's a good way of doing it is to claim you're trans. So this has been almost entirely fueled by the ubiquity of social media.
I'm with you. What's interesting is there's always been a segment of the population, always at least going back, a century or so, that have genuine gender dysphoria. But this rapid onset gender dysphoria is emerging primarily in adolescent girls without any history of gender dysphoria. Exactly. That tells me there's some type of social contagion taking place here.
So we've got 3 major claims to respond to here. Rapid onset gender dysphoria exists, it's a growing social contagion among AFAB people, and transitioning is incentivized by an overwhelmingly positive social response. Luckily, scientists and physicians have investigated these claims, and their research is publicly available. So let's see what they've found. We'll look at this study out of Sweden first. In its literature review, it covers previous research on the demographics of transgender people. Most studies on the prevalence of the transgender population examine differences by sex assigned at birth. Many have found a higher proportion of transgender women, this means people assigned male at birth, than transgender men, but the numbers have become more similar during the 2010s, particularly among younger generations. The gender difference is affected by how the population is measured. Indicative evidence suggests that transgender women are more likely to receive diagnoses and gender-affirming medical care than transgender men, while the ratios are more even in studies that rely on self-identification and include gender non-conforming or non-binary identities. So, have we seen the number of AFAB people identifying as trans and non-binary grow in the last decade? Yes, but really only to the degree where the number has finally caught up to that of people who are assigned male at birth. When the authors of this study analyzed the administrative data covering all residents of Sweden from 1973 to 2020, they found the following. While the rates increase over time for all age groups, the upward trend is starkest for transgender men aged 15 to 19. The increase for this group was particularly rapid from 2013 to 2016, but subsequently slowed down and reversed after 2018. For transgender women, we find an increase in younger age groups through 2014, but the rates are quite stable thereafter. The researchers analyzed their data to see if COVID-19 related factors accounted for the recent plateau in these rates, but they found that they did not. Figure S1 in the supplementary material shows that the reversal in diagnosis rates began before the pandemic, with the largest decline in the second half of 2019, and mostly affected transgender men in younger age groups. We conclude that these shifting rates are unrelated to COVID-19 and reflect other processes that have primarily affected the transition rates of younger transgender men. So yes, in Sweden there has been growth in the number of young people transitioning, but the rate has either steeply declined or plateaued depending on demographic factors in the last several years. This is not consistent with the hypothesis of a recent social contagion disproportionately affecting one sex. Interestingly, it does actually compare relatively well to that graph which LGBT allies like to bring up, where left-handedness dramatically increased as stigma decreased and then plateaued. But of course, I still have a lot more to cover. A 2022 study in the Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics looked into this subject in the United States, surveying a large number of adolescents in 2017 and 2019. A couple of initialisms you should know as I read this. TGD means transgender and gender diverse, AMAB means assigned male at birth, and AFAB means assigned female at birth. Turns out these are not just ideological insider lingo. These are actually very useful terms in actual medical research, which is why a lot of people use them now. The discussion section reads as follows. Using a national sample of United States adolescents, we found that there were more TGD AMAB adolescents than TGD AFAB adolescents in both 2017 and 2019. Additionally, the total percentage of TGD adolescents in our sample decreased from 2.4% in 2017 to 1.6% in 2019. This decrease in the overall percentage of adolescents identifying as TGD is incongruent with a rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis that posits social contagion. The AMAB-AFAB ratio, still in favor of more TGD-AMAB participants for both years, shifted slightly toward TGD-AFAB participants from 2017 to 2019. Importantly, this change was due to a reduction in the number of TGD-AMAB participants rather than an increase in TGD-AFAB participants, again arguing against a notion of social contagion with unique susceptibility among AFAB youth. Moreover, we found that TGD youth were more likely to be victims of bullying and to have attempted suicide when compared with cisgender youth, which is consistent with past studies. Our additional analyses reveal that TGD youth experience significantly higher rates of bullying than cisgender sexual minority youth, who themselves experience significantly higher rates of bullying when compared with cisgender heterosexual youth. These exceptionally high rates of bullying among TGD youth are inconsistent with the notion that young people come out as TGD either to avoid sexual minority stigma or because being TGD will make them more popular among their peers, both of which are explanations that have recently been propagated in the media. As if that wasn't bad enough for Sean and Frank's claims, there's still more research that debunks them. In the Journal of Pediatrics, we find a 2021 study directly investigating the notion of the supposedly contagious rapid onset gender dysphoria. If the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis indeed characterizes a distinct clinical phenomenon, and these youth access referrals to hormone suppression or gender-affirming hormones, then we would expect to see differentiation within clinical samples between those with more recent or rapid onset versus more remote knowledge regarding their gender. Based on the published hypotheses, we would expect more recent gender knowledge to be associated with self-reported mental health measures, mental health and neurodevelopmental disability diagnoses, behaviors consistent with maladaptive coping, e.g. self-harm, support from online and or transgender friends but not parents, and lesser gender dysphoria. We aim to test these hypotheses. And what did they find? We did not find support within a clinical population for a new etiological phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria during adolescence. Among adolescents under age 16 years seen in specialized gender clinics, associations between more recent gender knowledge and factors hypothesized to be involved in rapid onset gender dysphoria were either not statistically significant or were in the opposite direction to what would be hypothesized. So the data did not support the ROGD hypothesis. Check out what the authors say next. This putative phenomenon, ROGD, was posited based on survey data from a convenient sample of parents recruited from websites, and may represent the perceptions or experiences of those parents rather than of adolescents, particularly those who may enter into clinical care. Yeah, what proponents of the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis rarely mention, or perhaps don't even know, is that the study that proposed the idea never directly assessed any trans individuals in the first place. Author Lisa Littman surveyed parents of gender nonconforming adolescents on their children's development of gender dysphoria and social influences. She recruited these parents using websites Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Trans Critical Professionals, which are groups where participants already believe that being trans is a social trend and advocate for legislation against access to trans healthcare. Basically, this study just established that 256 parents perceived their child's gender dysphoria to be little more than a trend. This does not give any kind of clinical or scientific validity to the notion that rapid onset gender dysphoria exists, much less explains the previously growing numbers of people identifying as trans or non-binary. This study has been extremely heavily criticized by researchers in this field, so much that the American Psychological Association and 61 other healthcare providers' organizations signed a letter in 2021 denouncing the validity of rapid onset gender dysphoria as a clinical diagnosis. To put the final nail in the coffin for the claim that people claim to be trans for positive attention, remember that this study found exceptionally high rates of bullying among TGD youth. Additionally, transgender people are over 4 times more likely than cisgender people to be victims of violent crime, according to the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law. This directly contradicts the trans for positive attention narrative. So, yeah, if we're to get back to Sean and Frank, they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. I guess it turns out that getting a PhD in Christian apologetics doesn't involve learning how to read scientific articles. That's a shocker. You know what I'm about to say, though, right? Yeah, this is not where they're spreading a misinformation ends. Hooray, more content. You guys are probably bored by now, right?
As I mentioned earlier, why, when our psychology and our biology are mismatched, we think the solution is to change our biology. I mean, why would you change your biology? We don't do this with parallel conditions, and probably the closest parallel condition would be anorexia. You know, when somebody is anorexic and they say, but I'm overweight, you would not say, you're right, let me give you liposuction. You would say, dear, your mind's playing tricks on you. You're a dangerously underweight. We need to get you nourishment. We're not going to get you liposuction. Yet, why would we say we're going to cut off perfectly healthy sex organs when somebody has a delusion, a mental condition that is causing them to believe something they are not? Another example would now be the transabled. I don't know if you've heard of this recently, Sean, but there are people out there who are claiming that they're disabled even though everything's working perfectly fine. And so some of them want to have their limbs removed so they can be disabled. Now, what doctor would say, you're right, you are disabled, let me take off your arm or let me take off your leg? Any doctor would be sued for malpractice if they ever did that, rightfully so. And yet we're also saying, well, let's cut off perfectly healthy sex organs because someone has this gender dysphoria condition. That's not the solution. You don't treat a mental condition with surgery in most cases. You treat it with psychiatry or counseling or prayer. That's what we need to do.
This is the kind of argument one makes when they're ignorant of the body of research on trans healthcare and unfamiliar with how clinicians classify psychological conditions. Turek presents anorexia nervosa and obscure cases of so-called transableism as parallel to gender dysphoria. But actual medical professionals who study this don't. Anorexia is treated with various forms of talk therapy in combination with drugs like SSRIs, along with medically supervised nutritional rehabilitation. And that's because these treatments have been shown to effectively treat it. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual also classifies body dysmorphia and eating disorders separately from gender dysphoria, because they are assessed and treated substantially differently. Meanwhile, the extremely rare phenomenon of transableism, or as some have unofficially called it, body integrity identity disorder, is not in the DSM-5 or any other diagnostic manual of psychological conditions that I'm aware of. It has not been extensively studied, and there's no generally accepted evidence-based treatment. However, a quick search of trans-ableism does reveal exclusively right-wing media, which often positions itself against LGBT rights, peddling sensationalistic stories about it, comparing it to the rather well-studied gender nonconformity. It seems like Frank Turek might be getting his information about the classification and treatment of various psychological conditions from clickbait news articles. Would it be fair to say that transphobia is a social media contagion? Because this is at least one strong data point for that. So, clinical understanding and classification of something like gender dysphoria has changed over the years. When I began my psychology degree in 2012, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was on its 4th edition and contained diagnostic criteria for gender identity disorder. By my first summer semester in 2013, the DSM-5 debuted. In this new edition, gender identity disorder was eliminated and replaced by gender dysphoria. This new classification contains different criteria, and the DSM now explicitly states gender nonconformity is not in itself a mental disorder. Clinicians today do not consider gender variance a pathology and will often specify dysphoria is from the distress caused by the body and mind not aligning and/or societal marginalization of gender variant people. So like I said, people who are actually qualified, unlike Frank Turek, do not see non-traditional gender identity as some sort of delusion to be fixed with conversion therapy. Besides, approaches like social transitioning, hormone therapies, and surgical interventions are evidence-based treatments. Scientific literature readily supports the efficacy of these treatments for improving self-image, self-esteem, improving quality of life, and lessening the severity of depression symptoms. Let's take a quick look at that literature. This study from all the way back in 2013 examined the effects of testosterone treatment with or without chest reconstruction surgery on mental health in female-to-male transgender people. It found that participants who were receiving testosterone endorsed fewer symptoms of anxiety and depression, as well as less anger than the untreated group. Participants who had chest reconstruction surgery in addition to testosterone reported less body dissatisfaction than both the testosterone-only and the untreated groups. Furthermore, participants who were injecting testosterone on a weekly basis showed significantly less anger compared with those injecting every other week. So, the authors concluded, results indicate that testosterone treatment in female to males is associated with a positive effect on mental health on measures of depression, anxiety, and anger, while chest reconstruction surgery appears to be more important for the alleviation of body dissatisfaction. On to the next study, which is yet another from the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. This was a first-of-its-kind, long-term longitudinal evaluation of young transgender people who received puberty-suppressing hormones during adolescence and then cross-sex hormones and gender reassignment surgery in young adulthood. Note that we're not talking about children getting cross-sex hormones or surgery because that's not how this stuff works. That's a lie made up to get you mad, and it's pushed by people who don't think anyone should be trans in the first place. The following factors were investigated: psychological functioning indicated by gender dysphoria, body image, global functioning, depression, anxiety, emotional and behavioral problems; objective well-being indicated by social and educational or professional functioning; subjective well-being indicated by quality of life, satisfaction with life, and happiness. The authors found the following. After gender reassignment in young adulthood, the gender dysphoria was alleviated, and psychological functioning had steadily improved. Well-being was similar to or better than same-age young adults from the general population. Improvements in psychological functioning were positively correlated with post-surgical subjective well-being. They concluded then, a clinical protocol of a multidisciplinary team with mental health professionals, physicians, and surgeons, including puberty suppression, followed by cross-sex hormones and gender reassignment surgery, provides gender dysphoric youth who seek gender reassignment from early puberty on the opportunity to develop into well-functioning young adults. Next, we'll look at a systematic review examining the effect of cross-sex hormonal treatment on mental health and well-being in gender dysphoric people. The authors chose 17 studies for systematic analysis, with these studies investigating different aspects of mental health in response to cross-sex hormonal treatment. Both cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies were represented. The authors found that When treated with hormone therapy, gender dysphoria individuals reported less anxiety, dissociation, perceived stress, social distress, and higher mental health-related quality of life and self-esteem. This review also discussed specific mechanisms by which these results could come about. The mechanism which they gave the most credence was the treatment's efficacy in reducing non-satisfaction connected to the incongruent body image of gender dysphoric people. This incongruent body image, they suggested, was not a fixed psychological problem which persisted regardless of external factors. This contrasts with psychological disorders like, say, body dysmorphia. The authors concluded, this review suggests that gender dysphoria-related mental distress may benefit from hormonal treatment intervention, even recognizing the suffering of non-hormone-treated gender dysphoria individuals, which represents a possible risk factor for more severe or full syndromal psychiatric disorders. Mental distress in gender dysphoria may be considered as a transient reaction to the non-satisfaction connected to the incongruent body image and not necessarily a stable psychiatric comorbidity. In this perspective, timely hormonal treatment intervention represents a crucial issue in gender dysphoria individuals' mental health-related outcome. There are even more articles with similar findings out there, but I think you get the point. This has been recognized as efficacious, evidence-based treatment for gender dysphoria in adults and adolescents for a while now. But lastly, let's look at the results of the 2022 US Transgender Survey. This surveyed over 92,000 people aged 16 or older and included lots of questions about demographics and life experiences. We'll just look at reports of satisfaction with transitioning in various ways. 94% who lived at least some of the time in a different gender than the one they were assigned at birth reported that they were either a lot more satisfied, 79%, or a little more satisfied, 15%, with their life. 98% who were currently receiving hormone treatment reported that receiving hormones for their gender identity or transition made them either a lot more satisfied, 84%, or a little more satisfied, 14%, with their life. 97% who had at least one form of surgery for their gender identity or transition reported that they were either a lot more satisfied, 88%, or a little more satisfied, 9%, with their life. Notice how the physical medical interventions actually correlate with more satisfaction and less dissatisfaction than social transitioning alone. It's almost like these treatments reduce gender dysphoria and bring about better quality of life. Once again, Frank Turek is completely out of his depth on this subject, while Sean nods along, seemingly unaware that the guy he invited on to inform his audience is profoundly ignorant, spreading nothing but misinformation. You know, I would consider advocating against evidence-based medical care for anyone to be a harmful action. Remember that Frank Turek himself said that harming LGBT people is wrong within his own moral paradigm. It's really not looking so good for you here, Turek. You might want to consider repenting, or at least not acting like you're an expert on medical science when your actual career is mostly just arguing with college students about Jesus. And now, on to the next clip. Why do I do this to myself?
Why? Especially for kids, we can't be encouraging them to do these irreversible things to their bodies, to their perfectly healthy bodies. We need to get them counseling. And by the way, 80% of young people that have this so-called gender dysphoria, whether it's social media driven or not, grow out of it by the time they're 18. So it really makes no sense to give them cross-sex hormones or surgery, permanent solutions to a temporary problem.
Wait, he did it. He actually cited a statistic from a study. So he does think that scientific evidence on this subject is relevant and should be considered when determining treatment. Interesting. Unfortunately for Turek, this claim of his is not actually true. This claim that 80% of young people diagnosed with gender dysphoria grow out of it by the time they're 18 is known as the desistance myth. Here's where it comes from. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Edition 4, released in 1994, included diagnostic criteria for gender identity disorder. This included criteria for diagnosing children, such as persistence in wearing clothing stereotypical of the opposite sex, persistence in playing cross-sex roles in pretend play, intense desire to participate in pastimes stereotypical of the opposite sex, and strong preference for playmates of the opposite sex. It also included the criterion repeatedly stated desire to be or insistence that he or she is the other sex. However, it did not require that criterion to be met for official diagnosis. In the 20 years that followed, this disorder and its criteria was found to be inadequate for assessing issues of stress related to gender, so it was eliminated as a disorder in the DSM-5, which now contains updated, more specific diagnostic criteria for a different condition, gender dysphoria. For adults, these criteria revolve around a strong desire to be or identity with another gender. And for official diagnosis for children, one must meet the criterion a strong desire to be of the other gender or an insistence that one is the other gender. Now, the origin of this 80% desistance statistic originates from a 1995 study by Kenneth Zucker and Susan Bradley, where they found that out of the 45 gender nonconforming children in their study, 80% were not found to be transgender at follow-up in their high school years. Since this was 1995, none of these young people were ever diagnosed with gender dysphoria in the first place, and the sample actually represented a wide spectrum of gender nonconformity, not just those who actually desired to be or insisted they were a different sex or gender. I mean, the study contained kids who did not express desire to be or identification with another gender, but rather just preferred to dress or play differently than those stereotypical of their sex. This was not a sample of exclusively transgender or gender dysphoric kids by today's standards. Many other studies followed before the reform of gender identity disorder and its flawed diagnostic criteria. With samples that did not differentiate between those with a persistent desire or insistence to be the other sex and those who were gender nonconforming in other ways, researchers found wildly varying but significant rates of those who did not identify as another sex or gender in adulthood. In 2013, a particularly common source for the myth was published. This is the one I've personally seen cited the most, the infamous Thomas Steensma study. Certain people really like to quote this part of the introduction, which states that at the time of follow-up in adolescence or adulthood, these studies showed that for the majority of children, 84.2%, the gender dysphoria desisted. Now, if you check the citation for this, you find another of Steensma's studies published in 2011. So where in this 2011 study do we find that number? Also in the introduction, which is weird. Here, Steensma calculated that gender dysphoria persisted into adolescence for only 15.8% of dysphoric children. This implies that 84% of dysphoric children see their dysphoria desist. He calculated this number by combining the results from several previous studies. He does not show his work here, which is very unusual for scholarly psychiatric research. However, he does cite each of these previous studies, and there we find a few problems. Notice that 7 out of 10 studies were done even before gender identity disorder was standardized in 1994. A few date all the way back to the 1960s and 70s, when there was not yet any standard clinical understanding of gender identity. Even the most recent 3 were done before gender dysphoria replaced the defunct gender identity disorder. Without a clinical standard sufficient for classifying someone as having gender dysphoria versus other gender nonconformity, these studies could not have reliably identified samples made up of individuals who would be considered transgender or gender dysphoric by today's standards. So, this 84% desistance figure is meaningless, not to mention dubiously sourced. But what about the rest of Steensma's 2013 study? Doesn't it support the idea that a majority of gender dysphoric youths desist? Well, let's take a look. The study involved a sample of 127 youths diagnosed with gender identity disorder at the Center of Expertise on Gender Dysphoria in Amsterdam as children. So we're already dealing with a defunct diagnosis, which is insufficient for discerning between gender dysphoria and other gender nonconformity. But let's continue to see what else we find. They identified 37% of these participants as persisters, as they reapplied to the clinic in adolescence, requested medical treatment, were diagnosed again with gender identity disorder, and considered eligible for treatment. Meanwhile, 63% of participants did not return to the clinic, so the researchers counted them as desisters automatically. The participants could have not returned for any number of reasons other than their dysphoria going away, but I guess we'll never know. With methodological flaws this significant, any conclusion from this that a majority of gender dysphoric youths desist is not valid. You know what's interesting, though, is what the researchers involved in these two studies found from interviewing the participants who actually did show up at the clinic again. An excerpt from the discussion section of the 2013 study reads, "Persisters indicated that they believed that they were the other sex, and the desisters indicated they wished they were the other sex. This difference may also underlie our finding of a higher report of cognitive cross-gender identification in the persisters than in the desisters. Either they experience an alternative gender identification, or they interpreted the question differently. Nonetheless, explicitly asking children with gender dysphoria with which sex they identify seems to be of great value in predicting a future outcome for both boys and girls with gender dysphoria." That falls directly in line with current diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria and contradicts the narrative that we should not listen to young people who persistently identify as another gender because they will most likely stop doing so in the future. The most popular source people cite for the desistance myth fails to support and even contradicts the myth itself. Now, recent studies that look at persistence rates of trans youths without relying on outdated diagnostic criteria do not find that most desist. A 2022 study published in the Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics followed a sample of 317 youths who had made a binary social transition before the age of 12. At an average of 5.37 years after their initial transition, 94% were living as binary transgender youths, 3.5% were living as non-binary, and 2.5% were living as cisgender. Importantly, given all the political discussion around this, all those who retransitioned to cisgender did so by the age of 11, and only one ever received puberty blockers. None had received gender-affirming hormones. The authors stated, "These results suggest that retransitions are infrequent. More commonly, transgender youth who socially transitioned at early ages continue to identify that way." Studies of detransition rates in general, not just in youths, also find very low numbers. A recent systematic review of 27 studies involving a total of 7,928 transgender patients who underwent any type of gender-affirming surgery found that the prevalence of regret after gender-affirming surgery was 1%. Another recent study with a large sample size, almost 2,000 individuals who underwent gender-affirming surgery, found that only 6, that's 0.3%, either requested reversal surgery or transitioned back to their sex assigned at birth. I promise I'm almost done with statistics here, but I've just got to mention the largest survey ever done that assessed this issue, the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey. What did it find? 8% of respondents reported having detransitioned at some point. Most of those who detransitioned did so only temporarily. 62% of those who had detransitioned reported that they were currently living full-time in a gender different than the gender they were thought to be at birth. Respondents who had detransitioned cited a range of reasons, though only 5% of those who had detransitioned reported that they had done so because they realized that gender transition was not for them, representing 0.4% of the overall sample. The most common reason cited for detransitioning was pressure from a parent at 36%. 26% reported that they detransitioned due to pressure from other family members, and 18% reported that they detransitioned because of pressure from their spouse or partner. Other common reasons included facing too much harassment or discrimination after they began transitioning, 31%, and having trouble getting a job, 29%. So only a minuscule number of people who transition end up detransitioning, and it appears that most of the time they only do so because they face negative social consequences like discrimination from family, friends, and even employers. We absolutely should be compassionate toward those who regret their transition, just as we should be compassionate toward those with vaccine injuries. But being compassionate toward that very small statistical minority does not have to entail placing restrictions on the vast majority. Taking away evidence-based medical intervention for the vast majority who do benefit from it hurts far more people than it could ever potentially help. What we should not do, though, is get our information about matters of science and healthcare from people like Frank Turek, a man with a PhD in Christian ministry and no education in any scientific discipline. He clearly has not read or understood the studies he's attempted to cite here. Given Turek's strong affiliation with Republican political efforts, I have a pretty good guess for where he picked up this falsehood. In the US, the desistance myth is one of the most common myths presented in hearings on legislation that would affect trans rights to healthcare and access to public spaces. The state of Montana passed a ban on certain medical treatments for minors with gender dysphoria, where proponents cited this myth as part of its justification.
The false narrative that there is something wrong with you. Here, take some drugs that will forever alter you, alter your future choices, leave you with regret, that you will probably grow out of. 80% of people will come to their natural gender.
The conservative think tank, which ironically claims to protect individual freedom, the Heritage Foundation, has also shared this myth. And, of course, conservative lawyers have even spread the myth on Fox News.
Teenage transitioners desist from transition at a 80 to 90% rate.
Yet again, it seems that Frank Turek is getting his information about issues of science and medicine from sensationalistic right-wing sources. This is apparently what passes for someone qualified to speak on this topic on evangelical Christian platforms like Sean McDowell's YouTube channel. Given that these two are spreading a myth that is constantly used to remove legal access to evidence-based medical care for trans people, I think it's reasonable to say that they are complicit in harming LGBT people, which I'll again remind you, Frank Turek has stated is evil and wrong. I think the picture is really starting to come together, Frank, that Mav was right about you having blood on your hands. I keep this little tract on my desk in my studio just to kind of remind me of the type of propaganda that's out there and that convinced me of all this stuff as a child. And, you know, it has this little guy saying, like, are you a good person? The answer is supposed to be no, basically. But, you know, I look at this little guy asking me if I'm a good person every day when I'm filming. And some days I'm not completely sure of the answer, but today I'm feeling pretty good relative to the people that I'm responding to. If that take was not harsh enough, then I have another that will probably hurt even more feelings. This is not where Sean and Frank's tirade of harmful misinformation stops. No, there's still more.
The ultimate health problem here, Sean, is this. As you mentioned, there are always exceptions. This doesn't apply to everyone, but this is the aggregate data. The aggregate data show that at about the 10-year mark after the so-called surgery, the suicide rate of people that get the surgery is 19 times higher than the general public. So there's a honeymoon period where people feel better, but about the 10-year mark, everything blows up. And tragically, the suicide rate goes through the roof because what was promised to them isn't fulfilled. You cannot change your sex. It's impossible biologically. And yet they've been told they can.
You know what would be nice? What I would just love, it would mean so much to me, if Turek actually cited his sources for, where he gets these numbers that he uses. That way, viewers could easily see where he's getting his information from and check out his assertions for themselves. I had to do some digging to find the source of his claim, and I'm pretty sure I found the study which he, or more likely whoever told him this, interprets to say this. The problem is, actually there are a lot of problems. The study was published in the journal PLOS ONE in 2011, although its data was gathered long before the publishing date. One thing that dates this study is the use of the term transsexual, which is what those in this field now call a non-preferred term. This term does not reflect current categorization standards for gender-diverse individuals and has been used as a sort of slur in other contexts. While quoting this study, I will read this term in order to precisely reflect what the authors wrote, but know that this is not considered a useful, accurate, or appropriate term in this kind of literature today. Now, Turek referred to what the aggregate data showed in his claim. This study did utilize aggregate data, which is a data sample collected on multiple variables or individuals in a population and compiled for statistical analysis. Without defining the context and parameters of aggregate data, citing the aggregate data communicates very little. It does sound very sciencey and authoritative, though. The specific aggregate data involved in this study was a sampling of all 324 sex-reassigned persons in Sweden from 1973 to 2003. It also contained a control group, a sample of 3,240 individuals from Sweden's general population who did not indicate a change in sex in census records and did not receive a diagnosis of gender identity disorder. This is a very specific data set from a specific context and should be referred to as such. The authors looked at mortality, psychiatric morbidity, accidents, and crime following sex reassignment, which included the rate of mortality by suicide. Over a 30-year period, they did find that mortality from suicide was much higher in sex reassigned persons compared to matched controls. 19 times higher, in fact. What they did not find, though, was a suicide rate that spiked 10 years after surgery. That 19 times higher figure was derived from analysis of the samples over a 30-year period. The study did not display a suicide rate that went up or down at any specific time. It doesn't even display data for when any of the suicides happened. All we know from looking at the tables which the study includes is that over a 30-year period, 10 sex-reassigned persons died by suicide, while 5 in the control group died by suicide. So where are people getting this 10 years idea? I think it's from this statement in the results section. The Kaplan-Meier curve suggests that survival of transsexual persons started to diverge from that of matched controls after about 10 years of follow-up. What this means is that the author's chosen method of graphing their data suggested that the number of transsexual persons who died in any way began to diverge from the number of people in the control group who died in any way after about 10 years. After all, the results section also states, the average follow-up time for all-cause mortality of sex-reassigned persons was 11.4 years, a median of 9.1 years. Just after this sentence about the Kaplan-Meier curve, we find a list of cause-specific mortalities and general statements about how common they were. This list includes cardiovascular disease, cancers, and yes, suicide. The cause-specific mortality from suicide is mentioned first. Now, I can understand how someone who is not familiar with reading super technical research articles could read this and think the 10-year statement indicated something about suicide rates. But it clearly does not. It refers to all-cause mortality, not cause-specific mortality. I should also point out that this study did not measure any kind of suicide rate for transsexual persons before they received sex reassignment surgery, so it did not assess whether risk for suicide increased or decreased as a result of surgery. An excerpt from the study's discussion section reads as follows. It is therefore important to note that the current study is only informative with respect to transsexual persons' health after sex reassignment. No inferences can be drawn as to the effectiveness of sex reassignment as a treatment for transsexualism. In other words, the results should not be interpreted such as sex reassignment per se increases morbidity and mortality. Things might have been even worse without sex reassignment. Finally, the researchers found that the all-cause mortality rate for sex reassigned persons from 1989 to 2003 was not significantly higher than in the control group. They reasoned that this could potentially be explained by improved health care for transsexual persons during the 1990s, along with altered societal attitudes towards persons with different gender expressions. Once again, the study that Frank Turek attempted to cite fails to support his claim and even directly contradicts two of his narratives. One, that this study somehow disproves the efficacy of surgical interventions for transgender people, and 2, that opposing trans identities is actually better for the health of trans and gender nonconforming people. As we discussed earlier, transgender people are at elevated risk for suicide, but those who receive high levels of support from peers and especially strong support from parents are at significantly lower risk. This suggests that a contributing factor to suicidality of trans people is the type of behavior Frank Turek encourages: refusal to acknowledge someone's gender identity and attempts to pressure them into identifying as cisgender. So, finally, let's tally all of Turek's false claims. Abuse and trauma cause non-heterosexuality and gender nonconformity. Not affirming queer people is the best way to help them. Being gender nonconforming is a social media contagion. Rapid onset gender dysphoria is real. Gender dysphoria can and should only be treated with therapy or prayer. Gender dysphoria is similar to and should be treated in the same way as anorexia. 80% of gender dysphoric youths grow out of it by age 18. Medical intervention for gender dysphoria does not help mental health outcomes, and trans suicide rates skyrocket 10 years after transition. Every single one of these. Wrong. Frank Turek, with the help of other Christian apologists like Sean McDowell, spreads misinformation in opposition to evidence-based approaches to improving and even prolonging the lives of LGBT people. This is, without a doubt, harmful. I'll remind you one final time that Frank Turek himself said that harming LGBT people is evil and wrong. So it's fair to conclude, even within Frank Turek's own moral paradigm, that what he's doing is evil and wrong. It's no stretch, then, to say that he has blood on his hands. I am entirely certain, though, that Frank Turek will not admit that he's done anything wrong whatsoever, regardless of his stated position on harming LGBT people, and regardless of what empirical evidence says about what harms LGBT people. The encounter with Mav we watched at the beginning was telling. Turek's response to a young queer person demanding his compassion was using rhetorical trickery to avoid a difficult conversation in which he could be held morally accountable for his wrongs. He then used Mav's accusation against him to get views on YouTube, and no doubt make hundreds if not thousands of dollars in the process. I don't doubt he will continue to do this, as it has made him very successful as a Christian apologist. I fully expect many people to defend him, arguing that he is preventing spiritual harm, which I didn't account for. It's true, I didn't account for that kind of harm because it can be defined in any way, even in ways that directly contradict each other. As a result, it is not measurable or quantifiable in any way. Narratives of spiritual harm, then, can be regarded as nothing but just that, narratives. Propagating narratives is kind of the whole game for pseudo-intellectuals like Turek and Sean, though, isn't it? If you actually check out their assertions, in this case about psychology and medicine, you find them to be empirically false. This does not deter them, though, as they can then tell a grand, unfalsifiable story about why they're still the good guys in noble service of truth. This is not what academic or intellectual honesty looks like. And for the sake of the countless people they harm with their storytelling, I hope that you, the viewer, will join Mav and I in holding them accountable. Okay, I cited a ton of sources in this one, all of which you can find in the description. I'd like to give a special thank you to Erin Reed, a journalist who covers trans issues here in the US. I only cited her once in this video, and it was about the political landscape, but I find her work so excellent and so inspiring that I just wanted to make sure and say thank you, Erin. Another huge thank you to my supporters on Patreon. I honestly have no clue whether I will receive any income from YouTube for this video or not, but I felt it was too important not to make, and my patrons make this kind of content possible. I also lose a lot of subscribers every time I affirm trans people as an atheist content creator. There's a transphobia problem in the atheist community, even though we're statistically pretty progressive. We gotta fix that, guys. But yeah, I have more content on LGBT issues on the way, so if you'd like to support that, consider supporting me on Patreon. A little Easter egg for the people who are still watching here. I got quote tweeted by the Babylon Bee guy when I shared a clip from this video. At least it was a clip from Sean and Frank's video where they're talking about how it's just so popular to be trans and that's why everyone does it. Our little buddy Seth assured me that it's not just Christian apologists who believe this ridiculous misinformation. It's also respectable atheists like Bill Maher. Yeah, I think I'm supposed to apparently take that seriously because he's an atheist, Bill Maher is, but yeah, I don't really get my information about science and medicine from comedians who question the germ theory of disease and don't understand how vaccines work, as well as another atheist comedian, Seth MacFarlane.
Just acknowledge that vaccines have ill effects on some people.
They do, of course they
anecdotally.
do. But statistically, it's here and it's here. It's like people. How many? 7 million people died of COVID. How many people died from the vaccine? Probably a few.
But
I don't know what the number is, but I know it's not 7 million.
Good try there, though, Seth. This one landed just as well as any of your Babylon Bee articles. Now, if you want to hear more from me, then subscribe. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.